Hello, I'm Kathy Kesselman, President of Blue Knot Foundation. I have with me today Pam Stavropoulos, our Head of Research. Hi, Pam.
Hi, Kathy. Hello, everybody.
Good to see you. Today we're going to talk about our new trauma-informed organisational guidelines. And, Pam has been integral, obviously, in doing the primary research and developing these. So I'll be asking Pam a few questions and she can elucidate.
Yes, we do have a number of sets of guidelines now, so it's nice to have another opportunity to clarify some of the differences in light of these new upcoming ones. So,
yeah. So, I mean, in 2012, we had a set of guidelines which did talk about trauma-informed care and service delivery. So why a new set in it'll be 2021 when they're released, Pam?
Yes, well, look, several years have gone by, of course, since 2012, and just as the clinical guidelines needed updating, so there's been quite a lot of movement in the organisational space. So just to clarify for people, what possibly was a little bit confusing in 2012, we actually produced two sets of guidelines within the one publication, didn't we? So there were the clinical guidelines for people who work therapeutically with complex trauma clients, whether counsellors or psychologists or mental health social workers, a lot of individual practitioner work doing therapy. But there was also the second set, and they weren't individual and they weren't about clinical treatment. This is perhaps where the confusion is. They were the trauma-informed organisational guidelines. And because we released them in 2012 in the same publication, perhaps the organisational ones got a little bit overshadowed by the clinical ones. I think that probably did happen. So we decided to release the updates separately. So the 2019, last year, we released the updated clinical ones, and we're now planning early next year to release the organisational ones that we can talk a bit about today.
Yeah. So Pam, surely not much has changed in that short period in this space. Has anything changed?
Oh, well, so much has changed in some ways. And of course, COVID is such a changed landscape. We're all already talking, aren't we, about the sort of pre-COVID, which, we're not in a post-COVID period yet, but we're all saying it just seems so long ago in some ways that anything that was produced, research or writing or policy-wise prior to 2020 really almost has a slightly antiquated feel about it because COVID has changed the landscape so much. And interestingly, for the organisational guidelines, COVID actually makes the organisational guidelines, especially relevant, because just as we know organisations need to be COVID safe, COVID sensitive, upgrade all their procedures around safety in relation to, coronavirus, so do we need to be aware of, in a sense, that extra layer of trauma, another context of trauma in which organisations are operating, and which people who are already traumatised with complex trauma are going to come into contact. So it's really a very timely update, I think, for the organisational guidelines.
I've certainly heard people say that, the guidelines are one thing, but putting them into practice is another. And, how much has happened in terms of implementation of the principles and actually enacting what they recommend?
Yes, well, this is one of the reasons why perhaps one of the most helpful sections of the updated guidelines will be exactly what trauma-informed organisational change means, because there are a number of misconceptions, and we've actually got a whole opening chapter, haven't we, on what trauma-informed approaches are and what they're not. So a lot of people might say, oh, they're already being enacted, how much has changed. But as you say, or as you're implying, it's one thing to talk about the principles, which most people probably do. I think most people know that, trauma-informed principles about safety and choice and collaboration and welcoming people and not pathologising them and seeing, symptoms as coping strategies related, but the way in which we treat people is very important. But how to actually implement them in the practice, and again, especially in a new terrain of COVID where everybody's highly stressed with a whole new, form of trauma, actually in some ways makes it more difficult and therefore more timely to say, what does it actually mean to implement in practice? And it's quite a mixed picture in some ways, and also because COVID's so recent, it's a very new terrain to be looking at how far we've come and what we need to be doing and so on.
Yeah. Of course, it is constantly evolving, and but there are a few examples where it has been implemented quite well successfully. I'm not sure if that's the right word, but with benefit.
Yes, well,
could
that,
you-
like the previous guidelines, we like to update with a bit of, some of the research chapters as well as the guidelines themselves. So we took 3 sort of broadly case studies or contexts. And one of them relates to the sanctuary model. People will have probably heard Sandra Bloom. It's an American-based model that is actually very, very influential now in various countries, including Australia, and it is actually operating at several centres in Australia, based at the MacKillop Centre in Melbourne and various sites. So we have a sort of chapter on the context of the sanctuary model as illustration of one approach, one very sort of specific but also broad approach of where it's already operating. So I think we felt, didn't we, that to illustrate that, it is actually being implemented in various places in different ways, to let people know, because there's a real risk, I guess, with these principles that they sound great and we all kind of nod and smile, but as you said, what's actually going on? So that's one, the sanctuary model is one approach. And then we have a case study of a subacute mental health unit in Tasmania. And people might have heard of Richard Benjamin, who's a psychiatrist in Tasmania, and he co-edited a book that's actually very important that came out, I think, at the end of 2018, was it, Kathy, on trauma-informed practice and care, so very relevant to these guidelines, and actually the first edited collection on trauma-informed practice in Australia and New Zealand, and also has some international chapters, contributors. So in our new updated guidelines, we've got a second case study of implementing trauma-informed principles in the Tasmanian subacute mental health unit, which will be interesting and hopefully helpful for people. And then we've got reference to the conversational model, which is actually a clinical model, and maybe we can say something in a minute about the differences, because again, there's a bit of confusion, but some of the principles of that model can be applied in some ways to any kind of contact with a person who's traumatized. So we've taken 3 quite distinct contexts and tried to say, look, trauma-informed practice does operate differently in different contexts. Here's 3 examples, and there are things in each of those for all of us to perhaps think about how we might take some of the findings and approaches of these contexts. So I guess the key point to mention is that trauma-informed organisational guidelines are not about clinical treatment. That's one of the biggest confusions, isn't it? People think, again, because the clinical guidelines perhaps overshadowed everybody and they're very important, but some people have thought, oh, I don't know anything about trauma-informed, that's for clinicians. But the organisational guidelines are around how people are treated as human beings. It's not about clinical treatment. It's just how do we relate to people generally, which is, in that way of welcoming, of safety, precisely the basic principles that tend to get sacrificed a bit when people are busy and in a hurry. So there's actually quite an irony that although there's more awareness of the need for trauma-informed principles, in organisations, the very places we're wanting them applied, all sorts of organisations, and that's the key point we make, not just mental health, there's ironically a risk that by virtue of being busy organisations, these basic principles will be compromised because people are just in a rush, in a hurry, trying to find a bed for a person, meeting someone who's stressed quickly. And, people don't behave often under stress. None of us probably do in ways that are optimal. So it's really important that people understand it's not about clinical treatment. It's not about reading a lot of research. All you have to know really is that the research supports these principles, that when people are treated humanely, it's about not making things worse rather than, clinical treatment. That actually assists the healing of trauma, and the neuroscience validates that disrupted neural pathways can be, realigned gently with positive relational experiences. So I think that's the good news for people. It's not about mastering a whole lot of, research or being a clinician. It's simply about, feeling confident about relating to people in a humane way and empowering and collaborating and so on.
Yeah, I mean, really, they're very universal principles.
Yes.
How we all as human beings like to be treated and need to treat one another.
Yes, and again, the risk, I guess, is that people take them for granted. Oh, we all know that. So people who've experienced complex trauma, of course, don't take those things for granted. If you've been violated or, within a duty of care relationship or abuse or trauma, those basic principles of being treated humanely, of being respected, of feeling safe, can be very fragile for people. They may not have experienced them before. So we might take them for granted a bit, some people, and say, oh, we of course we do that. But they're especially important for people with complex trauma. Yeah.
And I think the guidelines also talk about some other sort of misconceptions or myths.
Yes,
I'm
yeah,
just wondering if you'd sort of like to showcase a
yes.
few.
Yes, yeah. Well, another one is that, oh, trauma-informed care assumes that everybody who accesses mental health has experienced trauma. Well, that's actually not the case, and that's another interesting misconception to clear up. But we know from the research that many people have experienced trauma, that it's not always announced, it's not always recognised. So acting, having in mind that a person may have experienced trauma, it doesn't mean we literally think that everybody has. And this is where the interesting parallel with COVID is. I mean, obviously complex trauma and COVID in some ways quite distinct, but just as we know that people with COVID can be asymptomatic and we don't know whether or not we're carrying, the virus, in a different way, but a bit of a parallel, we don't know for sure whether someone's experienced complex trauma, but we still need to treat them with respect and humanely, and thinking they could have experienced trauma, just as in a different way, but a parallel with COVID. We can't assume that people don't carry the virus just because they may appear to be okay. So yeah, and the other good thing about trauma-informed prisons, they're not going to hurt anybody. So it doesn't matter that we're applying them with people who are not traumatized. It's not like every single person, like we said. But if we treat people in a trauma-informed way, that's going to assist people anyway, because we know that the research shows that positive relational experiences of people feeling empowered and heard and listened to and welcome, these are not sort of optional extras. These are absolutely the bedrock. And in fact, it's quite possible for evidence-based treatments not to be as effective if they're not administered in a trauma-informed way. If the clinician's busy or if the client feels not heard. So these aren't, optional minor points, as basic as they may seem. They actually undergird, effective treatment, even clinically, even though it's more about non-clinical treatment.
Yeah. Is there anything else you wanted to say? Any last points you think are really important to impart?
Probably just that the more basic and potentially taken for granted, the more precise of that reason that we have to be really careful. It's very tempting for us, we know all this, And in fact, that's one of the misconceptions we address, that it's already happening. A lot of people think, everybody's already doing that, or it's got the status of a kind of, motherhood statement. It's just being nice to people. But these assumptions that actually aren't borne out with people. Under stress, we tend to accelerate, all of us. Organisations and staff tend to get faster. And the faster we are, and it's often outside our awareness, the greater the risk that those basic, connecting principles will be compromised. So as much and all as we're saying, it's not, it's not difficult. It's just about humane treatment. And those things are true. It's precisely because we tend to accelerate under stress, and everybody's coping with all sorts of stresses now with COVID. But there's actually a bit of a risk that we do take them for granted so much that we're not constantly paying attention to how we treat each other. Mm-hmm. So one of the key features, it's the way in which we treat people, not just what the treatment is. And again, non-clinically, the way we relate to other people as human beings. So always trying to take that little bit of extra time to be aware of that, because it does optimise everything. Human interaction, clinical treatment, everything else.
Yeah. And of course, our interactions are just absolutely critical to just the rhythm of all life, everyday life. Just
absolutely. And Bruce,
apparently trivial.
Yes, absolutely. And Bruce Perry has a quote in, I think it's in The Boy Who Raises a Dog, his co-written book, that interactions with close other people are our major stress regulating mechanism. And that's really crucial, because there's still an assumption often that we're kind of, autonomous beings. We know we're interdependent, but there's still this view that we've kind of got to do it ourselves, or it's individual, it's personal. But the way we relate to key people in our lives is absolutely central to how we manage our own stress levels. So that relational piece is absolutely key. Yeah.
Thank you, Pam, as always, for your wisdom and your insights. It's always a pleasure to talk, and very excited to be launching these guidelines in hopefully in January 2021. So exciting, and they'll be available from the Blue Knot website for purchase or download. So thanks again, as always, Pam.
Not at all. Thanks, Kathy. Thank you.